Tonight we're in Dundee, and this is Question Time. And good evening, welcome to you whether you're watching or listening to this programme, and welcome to our panel tonight, here to answer questions and debate with our audience. The Conservative leader in Scotland, Ruth Davidson, the Deputy First Minister of Scotland, John Swinney of the SNP, Labour's health spokesperson in the Scottish Parliament, Jenny Mara, the leader of the Scottish Liberal Democrats, Willie Rennie, the convener of the Scottish Greens, Patrick Harvie, and the Daily Telegraph columnist and leader writer, Tim Stanley. Thank you very much. Just before we take our first question, don't forget Facebook, text or Twitter. The details are on the screen if you want to comment on anything that's said here, as I'm sure you may want to. Callum Richardson, your question, please.
Is a second independence referendum inevitable if Britain votes to leave the EU?
Will Scotland have a second referendum vote if Britain as a whole votes to leave the EU? Patrick Harvie?
My personal view is I suspect Scotland will choose to ask itself the question about independence again. I'll expect to be campaigning for a yes vote again. Not for the same reasons, I have to say, that some on the Yes campaign put forward. The Greens have always set out a distinctive path on this one. But I do hope that we don't have to address that question in the context of the UK having voted to leave the European Union. A political and economic union that I think is of far more value to us in Scotland in forging a more equal, a more socially just and in a more environmentally responsible community of nations. If we were to see the UK vote to leave the European Union, I think it would be very challenging for those of us who thought that we had better answers to offer for some of the questions such as currency than were put forward by the SNP in 2014. I think it would be very hard for us to say that this is a stable time in which Scotland could make that break, particularly as we might be talking about 2 years or more of negotiations. I think it's far better for Scotland and for the UK, whichever view you take of independence, that we vote together in as big numbers as we possibly can to stay in the European Union and then to turn it into the socially just and progressive and democratic union that it ought to be.
All right, thank you. Ruth Davidson. Just a reminder of the question. It's not to rehearse the arguments for in or out. It's about whether the second independence referendum would be inevitable if the UK as a whole voted out, but Scotland voted in.
No, I don't believe it is inevitable. I also believe, actually, that the whole of the UK will vote to stay in. That's certainly my hope. I think that we had a huge discussion about this. Certainly every event that I was at during the independence referendum, this was something that was known about and discussed before Scotland passed its vote. We passed a clear-cut vote. 2 million people said we want to stay part of the United Kingdom. And I've never understood the argument that the SNP has put forward that says that being part of the wider EU, if there was to be a Brexit, where we export 15% of our goods and services is so important that we would have to leave a union where we export 64% of our goods and services. But it's a really easy one to solve. It's a really easy one to solve because before the independence referendum, everybody senior in the SNP said it was once in a generation. Since then, they've refused to say that again, so I'll ask John to say it tonight.
Okay. Yeah. John?
I think
she's only asking you to say that.
Well, is she not am I not to answer the other question?
But you could answer hers first.
Well, once in a generation,
the view I take about this is that the people of Scotland are the people that will decide whether Scotland should be an independent country, and nobody, absolutely nobody, at least of all me, can take away the right of the people of Scotland to decide if they want to have another referendum and to decide if they want to be an independent country. And so I think that's an issue in the hands of the people of Scotland to decide when and if that happens. Now, on the substantive
question... Can I just
question...
stop you there? How do the people of Scotland decide whether to have a referendum, unless you have a referendum on whether to have a referendum?
Well, what there must be is... what there would have to be...
Nationalist Party has to legislate for it.
What there would have to be is just demonstrably clear support that people in Scotland wanted there to be an independence referendum and for Scotland to be an independent country. And ultimately that issue has to be resolved. in a referendum where people are free to vote the way they choose in that referendum.
And how would it be
Now,
affected, come to the main point, about if the rest of Britain voted out and Scotland voted in?
Well, the first thing I want to say is to agree with Patrick that I hope people will vote and vote decisively to stay in the European Union. I will be arguing for that. The SNP will be arguing for that. The Scottish Government will be arguing for that, because we believe that to be advantageous for the social and economic and environmental well-being of people in Scotland. So that's the argument I will put forward. Now, if we find ourselves in a situation where Scotland, for example, has voted decisively in favour of EU membership, but we are taken out of the EU because of votes out with the United Kingdom, fundamentally the promise that was given to people in the Scottish referendum, that you had to vote no to stay in the EU, that was the argument put forward. You must vote no to stay in the EU. Then I think fundamentally part of the promise of the no campaign has been breached and circumstances change in relation to the question of a further referendum.
Okay.
Are you genuinely trying to claim that the last Scottish independence referendum was actually a referendum on membership of the EU? Because I don't remember that.
Well, what I'm saying is that, well, on a constant basis, Tim, one of the arguments put forward by the No campaign, put forward by people around this table, was that the only way you could secure Scotland's membership of the European Union was to vote no, because that guaranteed your membership as part of the United Kingdom. And what I'm warning and cautioning about is that what the gamble the Prime Minister has taken with the EU referendum jeopardises Scotland's membership of the EU, and that was not what the Prime Minister promised in the Scottish referendum.
I think people are sick and tired of the SNP holding the entire country hostage and saying that whenever there is a policy that the Union as a whole wishes to follow, they will hold a referendum and leave. Now think about it. Let's say that actually happened. Let's say that Britain votes to leave the EU and Scotland then votes to go into it. What would happen on the basis of the finances that the SNP has left Scotland with? You'd have austerity forced upon you by the European Central Bank. So it's not even something you would want if you got it.
All right, let me hear from some members. Hold on, hear from some members. I'll come to you. Yeah, the woman there, in the, just two in the fourth row. Yes, you.
I thought we voted to stay in the UK in 2014. What's changed?
And what, in your view, has changed? Nothing?
Yeah, nothing.
So what would...
55.3% of the Scottish population voted no.
So if the UK as a whole voted Brexit, what would you think then?
I think it would give the SNP an opportunity and an excuse to hold another referendum.
And will you still vote no?
Yes.
Even if it meant not being in the year, OK?
And by the way, Scottish Eurosceptics do exist. Scottish Eurosceptics do exist.
You've said that
One
already.
recent poll showed that 36% of Scottish people want to leave the EU. The SNP needs to stop characterising all Scots as being SNP.
Jenny Mara.
Well, I don't think that the UK will vote to leave the European Union. I don't think people want to take that risk overall with the jobs and the economy. But, you know, if the UK does vote to come out and Scotland votes to stay, then it will very much be up to the people of Scotland, as John says, and as the First Minister says, if they want a second referendum. However, the means to that, I think, would be if the SNP were to put it in their manifesto, and I think that's a key question for this election coming up, whether John's party will put a second referendum in their manifesto, because if that did happen, there are big questions, as Tim said, about currency. You would then be in a situation, I mean, the SNP said they wanted to keep the pound, so we'd be in a sterling zone with the rest of the UK who would be out of the EU. I think we would be running the largest deficit out of any EU country. We'd be under a lot of pressure to join the euro. There is no guarantees that accession to the EU or as a continuing state, as John previously argued, would be guaranteed. But I believe that Scotland is best within the UK and that the UK is best within the EU, and that's what I'll be campaigning for in June.
I cannot believe I've just heard the Labour Party selling the jersey on a second independence referendum sitting next to me right now. There's such a mess on this. You've got candidates standing that support independence. Half of your candidates are putting out things saying a once-in-a-generation decision, let's hold Nicola Sturgeon to that promise on independence. And you're sitting here saying John Swinney's right that this could happen. Let's get yourself in order. They said before the referendum it was once in a generation. The people of this country made a choice. They voted, more than 2 million people voted to stay in.
And I
we should
voted no
honour
as
that
well.
choice, and we should make sure that we speak up for the people who voted no.
Willie Rennie.
I think Ruth is right, that we should honour the choice that people in Scotland made. It was supposed to be a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. But the danger that the Conservative Party are imposing on Scotland is that they are now threatening to leave the European Union. I mean, our ancestors would look down with incredulity if they even thought we were considering leaving the continent of Europe and all the benefits that come with it.
We're not moving to the Caribbean.
No, hold on, Tim. This is exactly what the Tories have put on Scotland. And the danger is that if we do leave, then it opens up the whole issue about independence all over again. And it's not because of the 2 million voters who voted no. It's because of Ruth's party, who's determined to keep the issue alive.
Sorry, you say keep it alive. You've got the Prime Minister, I mean, it may not, I don't know how much counts for here, but you've got the Prime Minister urging to stay, a Remain vote. So why do you say the Conservative Party are in favour of an out vote?
There's large numbers of the Cabinet are arguing for exit, credible people on the other side, and it's all because the Tories cannot keep themselves together on Europe, and they're now dividing the country as a result. I don't think that's in the interest of Scotland.
What I'd like to do,
I don't think it's in the interest of the
a number
UK.
of you got your hands up. Can I just try this? Can I hear from anybody here in the audience who is going to vote out, and what they think the implications... Oh, a lot of hands going up. And what the implications would be. I'll take you, the man there on the gangway.
I doubt that in the event of Brexit, that given the scale of the public finances in Scotland, the gaping big hole that we have, that basically prove the white paper, Mo Better and Bogrel, that the actual the Scottish people will vote to leave the United Kingdom.
Any other Brexit? Yes, the person in the second row from the back there.
I think it's ridiculous to suggest that we should vote to rejoin an organisation if we do stay part of it, which costs us billions of pounds every year, which means that Scottish farms and Scottish fisheries are run by Brussels, which means that we don't have control over our own borders and we can choose who comes here, and which means that we have austerity forced on us by the European Union, as we've seen with Greece, as we've seen with Ireland. I have no idea why people would campaign to rejoin or stay part of an organisation which forces Scotland into these situations.
So do you think Nicola Sturgeon and indeed John Swinney's view that, well, in Nicola Sturgeon's word, almost certainly there'd be a second independence referendum if the vote was Brexit? You think that's a policy that won't have traction here in Scotland? People object to it, or do you think it'll be something you go through and maybe Scotland votes independent?
I think people would object to it on grounds that why would we want to leave the United Kingdom and the cost that would come with that to rejoin an organisation which would cost us even more money and which we would then give away the control that we've just took back from Europe.
Yeah. John Swinney?
I think what that argument doesn't pay attention to is what are the views of the people of Scotland in all of this. Because if the people of Scotland have voted yes to stay in the European Union and the rest of the United Kingdom votes us out of the European Union, a fundamental promise and commitment that was given to people that by voting no in the Scottish referendum we would secure our membership of the European Union will have been breached. And ultimately what I believe is that the people of Scotland are sovereign. They're the ones that are entitled to determine their own future and to decide to whom they give their sovereignty. Do they give it to Westminster, or do they give it to the European Union, or do they retain it for themselves, or do they decide to share it with whatever institution they wish to share it with? That is a fundamental choice for the people of Scotland, and nobody can take that choice away from the people of Scotland.
The man there in the blue shirt, you were shaking your head at that.
Are we holding politicians to say to stick to the promises? Because you promised it was once in a lifetime. So what's the deal?
What was the nature of the promise that if Scotland voted no to independence, it would mean you were guaranteed to stay in the EU? Because there'd already been the promise of a referendum on that. Nobody can promise that.
And it was every single debate I did, you brought it up every single time. People knew when they were voting at the independence referendum that the Conservative Party had said that we would have a referendum on the European Union and everyone would have their say. And I think that...
Well, Ruth, come on. You listened to the same debates as I did. The Prime
I was
Minister,
in them.
The Prime Minister
and the
was
SNP
here.
raised
The
this
Prime- no,
every
but
single
the Prime-
time,
the
John.
Prime
Every
Minister,
single
the Prime
time
Minister
he
was
used
here
this.
saying to people, if you want to secure your place in the European Union, you cannot choose to vote yes because that won't guarantee you membership. You've
Won't
got to
guarantee you
vote no.
entry.
That was the promise that the Prime Minister made to the people of
And
Scotland.
do you know the promise
and
that you
will be
made?
broken
Every single
if
time
there
you
is
made a
Brexit.
promise that you would honour the referendum result, you wouldn't call a second one, it was once in a generation. Your boss, Nicola Sturgeon, signed the Edinburgh Agreement that said we will respect the result. Why are you not respecting the result that we had 18 months ago?
We've entirely respected the result. We have worked to secure the work of the Smith Commission. We've worked to secure the Smith Commission that agreed the further powers after that. We've worked to deliver the Scotland Bill, which Parliament will consider in the next couple of weeks. We've respected the result, but fundamentally, we respect the right of the people of Scotland to determine their own constitutional future.
Which is
That's
why
what
there's
I
a
respect
referendum on
in the
EU
people of
membership.
Scotland.
Because their votes will be counted.
There's hardly a week goes by, John, that you don't seek an opportunity to say, if this does not happen on our terms, we're going to have another independent referendum. That's exactly what happened. You betrayed the trust of people who said, you were promised to the people of Scotland that there would be a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. You have gone back on that promise, and I think people in Scotland will not forgive you for that.
Okay. No, man to his left. Yeah.
First point to Jenny Mara, you said that you're pushing again for the SNP to put in their manifesto that they would have another referendum.
No.
The clue is in the name, the Scottish National Party. Their aim has never changed. It's like saying the Green Party wouldn't, if they lost an election, would cease to be a Green Party. Yes. They are always for independence. Get used to it. The second point is Ruth Davidson. David Cameron clearly came up to Scotland and the whole Project Fear team and told the people of Scotland, if you vote no, you will be guaranteed to stay in the EU. If you vote yes, Scotland will be out the EU. That was a definite, repeated threat to the Scottish people. The third point,
when you say that, you can't go all around the panel because you'll be here all night. No, hold on a second. Hold on. Did you or did you not know there was going to be a referendum on whether Britain as a whole should stay in the EU?
Promised in 2013.
Yes, but the conflict between that was David Cameron and Project Fear coming to Scotland.
But these are two different things, aren't they?
One is to
say if you leave the UK, you're on your own, you'll have to make your own decisions versus the EU and membership. Yes. The other is stay, but there is going to be a referendum. I don't know.
But it was most definitely not expressed in that fashion. It was expressed in the fashion, vote no and you're guaranteed to keep your membership of the European Union.
Well,
that's what the Prime Minister promised to deliver.
You were taken in, John, weren't you? Because you'd forgotten the referendum was coming.
David, that's what people in Scotland, that's what was in the minds of people in Scotland. That's what they were told.
Had you forgotten the referendum?
Well, I voted yes in the referendum, David. I'm very proud
on
of
the
that.
European referendum.
I'm very proud that I voted yes to the Scottish referendum.
You haven't voted on the EU referendum yet, that's what I'm talking about. But you say in the middle there, shaking your head again. Let's hear from you.
Davidson made my point that we knew there would be an out-EU referendum if the Tories won the 2015 general election. So we voted no for better or worse. And John Swinney is effectively saying we were too stupid to understand that point, and he holds all the no voters in complete contempt. Incredibly insulting.
Yes.
The thing that astonishes me, actually, is not that John Swinney or anybody else is forever banging on about a second referendum. It's the parties that were on the no side that can't give up talking about a second referendum. It's really quite bewildering. Look, we've got two choices.
Stop as soon as they repeat the words. Once in a generation, I will happily never mention it again. But for as long as they, continue to threaten and push, someone has to stand up for the no voters.
Two choices to make in Scotland in the coming months. One is what kind of government are we going to elect, and what kind of parliament are we going to elect, bold enough and strong enough to hold the government to account. And the second is whether we wish to stay members of a European Union which does does strive for controls on bankers' excesses when the UK government tries to block it, whether we want to stay part of a European Union that does try to get some degree of collective response to a humanitarian crisis in Europe, the likes of which we haven't seen for generations, when a UK government is saying, we want none of it. I know which way I'm voting on both those issues.
Let's just take... we can't stick on Europe all the time, but I just want to take this question from John Gordon, if we can find you. John Gordon.
Aye. Is the in-out vote on Europe not important enough to listen to what the Queen thinks about it?
Ah, should the... yes. Do you think it is?
Well, I think she does more for the country than half of the people elected in Westminster.
Because the Sun, of course, had a headline this week saying Queen backs Brexit and reports her as telling MPs at a reception, I don't understand Europe, and later saying the EU is heading in the wrong direction. So the question is, why shouldn't we know what the Queen thinks? Tim Stanley, do you think we should know what the Queen thinks?
Only if she wanted us to know. And the important point about that conversation is that it was a private conversation. Now, when the news got out, the newspaper was right to report it because that's what newspapers exist to do. What shouldn't have happened is that politicians shouldn't have gossiped about what the Queen may or may not have allegedly said in private. Okay. That was a mistake. Now, having said all of that, though, whenever we think about the monarchy and its role in politics and public life, it's very much shaped by the particular kind of monarch that Elizabeth II has chosen to be. Historically, it's quite unusual to have a monarch who is this removed from politics. Queen Victoria, for instance, used to write passionate letters to the newspapers demanding a ban on animal testing. So actually, monarchs have quite often been involved in politics, and it wouldn't surprise me if a monarch was concerned about the loss of sovereignty. It wouldn't surprise me if a monarch was concerned about the costs of being a member of the European Union. And it wouldn't surprise me if a monarch privately felt, we're the 5th largest economy in the world. We're a damn important country. We can afford to go it alone.
But the question is not... The question is not whether you, Tim Stanley, would be surprised at what you think the Queen may or may not think, but whether all of us should be entitled on an issue as important to know what she thinks. That's what the question is.
No, because that's not her constitutional role.
Well, okay,
she's not there to do that. But having said that, if she had intended people to know, then obviously we should know. But again, just to re-emphasise, we know that in the 1980s, we're pretty sure that the Queen spoke about how she was distressed at the state of poverty in Britain. We know she was concerned about the state of the Commonwealth and about apartheid in South Africa. Don't imagine that monarchs literally have no political views.
So, John Swinney, when she said just before the Scottish referendum, I hope people will think very carefully about the future, in your view, was that a deliberate, intentional intervention?
No, I don't. I think it was the Queen setting out that kind of thoughtful position that we would expect from the Queen. And I think the point that I agree with from what Tim has said is that if the Queen's had a private conversation with senior members of the government on Privy Council terms, which are, you know, we all know what those rules mean, they're supposed to be kept private, then, and a member of the government has thought it fit to go to Rupert Murdoch's wedding and then have a conversation there, which miraculously results in this story being reported on the front page of The Sun, I think it says more about senior members of the government than it says about the Queen.
So you think it was Michael Gove, do you?
Well, is it just me that's been wound up by that conspiracy theory, or is that maybe something that might have happened? I think, essentially, if the Queen is going to be outside of politics, which she's chosen to be, other than on the occasions where Tim quite rightly says she says something definitive, publicly, with her own words, then I think we should respect the Queen's decision not to be involved in politics.
All right, you sit up there.
Yeah, I'd just like to take the panel up on the idea that the Queen is supposedly outside of politics when, as you've just been discussing, she was apparently having some kind of tirade in a Privy Council meeting over lunch, and quite possibly that may have been what maybe influenced Michael Gove.
Oh, he was
She's a masterful politician,
Queen,
and with the calibre of some of our actual elected politicians, it's quite possible she's exerting much more of an influence than she should.
So she managed to win over Michael Gove.
You can picture the scene, can't you? You can imagine it. You can imagine it.
All right, Ruth Davidson, can you imagine the scene?
I think I would go on further than the original questioner, John, when he said that he thinks that the Queen's done more than most elected politicians. I actually think she's probably done more than all elected politicians put together for the last 64 years. And I think that there's a difference between unnamed sources gossiping about somebody else and gossiping about somebody who has done so much, particularly because she stayed above politics and had a study neutrality, because she's not able to then correct the record the next day and phone up the Sun. I think what we should all remember in this story as well is that, one, the Palace has denied it and has launched and has asked for an investigation to be launched by IPSO. Two, the Deputy Prime Minister, who was supposed to be one of the protagonists in this conversation, has utterly denied it. And three, the only people that seem to have graced the pages of the Sun with this are utterly anonymous and won't put their hands up. So we seem to have a story here that nobody can stand up. And I think that when you have a person like the Queen, who has done so much for her country because she stayed above politics and is unable to then make her position clear after the fact, actually I think that while I understand newspapers have to report news, I think this would have been best left alone by the people that spoke to the Sun newspaper.
OK. Anybody else want to come in on this? Yes.
Yeah, I mean, whether you take a positive view or not of how the current monarch has done her job, there is a very good reason why she's not entitled to have a vote, either in elections or in a referendum. You know, if this is someone who wished to be a private citizen and to exercise a vote, maybe even a vote for who the head of state would be, and we could all have a vote on that, I would welcome it. Obviously, it's difficult for someone in that position not to form a personal private view, but to take a political stance, whether in relation to members of the Privy Council or in any other setting, I think is entirely at odds with her current role. And if this private citizen called Elizabeth Windsor wanted to have that different role, she should say so. The thing that nauseates me...
Are you alleging that the story is true? That's what, are you implying it's true?
Well, it's in the Sun, so you form your own judgment. the thing that
I don't know what you mean by that. I mean,
the thing that nauseates me most about this story actually was hearing the editor of The Sun on the radio this morning claiming that they've done this to stand up for ordinary people against powerful elites. To hear the editor of a Murdoch-owned newspaper saying that we should all pay attention to what the Queen thinks because elites are a bad thing just makes my blood boil.
Well, do you want to come in on this?
I mean, I think for the strength of our country, I think, you know, however anyone feels about the monarchy, people would recognise that one of the main advantages of our Queen now is that she has stayed out and she's taken the decision, as Tim said, monarchs have the decision to get involved in politics or not. She's taken the decision, and I think that's been a strength of our democracy, and I think that should maintain. And I think if people are having private conversations with her, then that should be respected.
OK. Willie Rennie, do you want to come in on this?
No, it's fine. Move on. Yeah, that's fine.
You're done.
Fine, yeah.
OK. All done, as they say in the auctioneers. I'm in the auctioneers. All done. Cathy Aliberti, please. A question from Cathy, please. Yes.
Yes. Scottish Government figures yesterday revealed a £15 billion deficit. Is the economic case for independence now dead?
All right. This goes to the heart of the whole business, I think. Ruth Davidson.
Well, somebody very close to the Independence Project, a guy called Alex Bell, who was a chief advisor to Alex Salmond during the white paper writing process, said that the economic case was dead, that you can't sell a case for low taxation, high welfare, on an oil price that was unusually high, with revenues that were unassailable and unprovable, and that they've been found out, and the truth of the pudding has been in the eating. I mean, I think, without going back over the very first question that we had in the programme today, you know, I think that not only is Scotland better off for being part of the United Kingdom, and we see that by the Scottish Government's own figures, the tune of £1,400 per person, but actually I think the UK is better off for having us in it. And I think that this decision have being made, we should be pulling together and we should be trying to maximise all of our country, both sides of the border, to bring in more investment from other countries and elsewhere.
Yeah, but the argument was made was about the oil price, wasn't it? That was where the dip in the revenue came.
Well, it was actually about the oil revenue rather than the oil price.
Yes.
And this is the distinction that John Swinney's going to probably, I would expect, try and blur, because he likes to say that nobody suspected the oil price would drop and we all got it wrong. And that's just nonsense. The difference is we were saying even 2 years ago, I stood up at First Minister's questions and said that OBR says oil revenue for next year will be about £3 billion. Alex Salmond, tried to swap me aside saying, don't be ridiculous, it'll be £8 billion. Well, actually, it's going to be a lot lower than that. We did know that there was going to be a drop in revenue. We did know that the cost of extraction was going to be higher. We did know that there wasn't going to be as much profits, which meant we couldn't tax the companies as much, which meant there wouldn't be as much money flowing into the coffers. The difference is the SNP didn't make a case based on the fact that we'll be independent and we might take a short-term financial hit and move on. They made a case promising people in Scotland that they would be £500 richer. They knew that case was wrong when they made it. The case was false. They knew it was false and they tried to con the Scottish public, and I'm so glad that 2 million people voted no.
So just before I go to Mr Swinney, you're saying that the drop in the oil price is irrelevant?
No, I'm not saying it's irrelevant. Obviously, we'd like to see a higher oil price. But what I will say is the idea that we didn't know that oil revenues would be a lot lower than they had been and a lot lower than was being promised, that is false.
John Swinney.
What's at the heart of this debate is a debate about whether we have economic confidence here in Scotland. And when I look at the data that's been published yesterday, and of course the data contains very difficult news because of the fall in the oil price, and I don't think it is an irrelevant factor. It is a very significant fall in the oil price.
So, sorry, why do you think it's not irrelevant and she thinks it is irrelevant?
Well, Ruth can answer for herself. I think it's not irrelevant because the oil price has fallen very dramatically compared to where it had been.
More relevant.
And the issue is about how we nurture, on the North Sea oil and gas question, is how we nurture and encourage the investment climate to ensure that we can make the most of the resource that we have available to us. And if you look at the data, and it's not my data, it's independent data, it shows there is still a very viable and strong North Sea oil and gas sector if we can get the financial arrangements correct for that sector, and also if it's supported by an effective and higher oil price, because oil companies are struggling to prosper on the type of oil price that we have at the present moment. Now, the key judgment I think people have to make about the figures yesterday is whether we just take 1 year and say, well, that's it, or whether we look at a nation's finances over a longer period of time. And anyone that looks at a country's finances on a one-year basis could look at the UK and Scotland in 2008 and say, well, the deficit in the UK is double the deficit of Scotland, so it's all over for the United Kingdom. That's the kind of rationale that Ruth and her colleagues are trying to get us to believe today. So what I think we should take confidence from in Scotland is that our economic performance is improving. We've got higher employment than the rest of the United Kingdom. We've got growing productivity in Scotland, much higher than the rest of the United Kingdom in terms of growth in productivity. And we're seeing a growth in onshore revenues in Scotland, which should give us confidence. That's the heart of the argument for economic self-confidence here in Scotland. That's the argument.
All right, hold on. You go, Jenny.
John, in terms of GDP, our deficit in Scotland is double that of the UK's. Our deficit is the largest in the whole of the European Union.
Let him have a say. Yeah, go on.
I find it really sad, actually, the figures yesterday, because I'm sitting here today on a UK panel. We're all representing Scotland, and actually, our productivity and this deficit is so high. What does that say to people in Scotland that want jobs? How about people in Dundee that have been made redundant? Where are the jobs for them? Where are your government going to start addressing this instead of hiding behind these ridiculous figures, which actually just blow your case for independence apart completely?
Let's take two of the things you've just said, Jen. You've asked me about jobs. Scotland has a higher employment rate today than any other country in the United Kingdom. That is a fact. So we're in a stronger employment position than any other country in the United Kingdom.
Well, John, you go out and tell that to people in Dundee who have just been made redundant.
Well, it's a fact.
As a result of your cuts
Listen, I give every support and do everything I can to boost the Scottish economy, which is why we've got a higher employment rate than any other part of the United Kingdom. And Labour politicians should occasionally celebrate that, not condemn the government for delivering that here in Scotland. And the second thing is on productivity. There's been a 4.4% increase in productivity in Scotland since the SNP government came to power, compared to 0.2% in the rest of the UK.
Let's not get into that kind of detail. You start there.
Well, I don't think the employment figures are true of what you're saying, because when you take the people that have been sanctioned, and it's in Britain, but particularly in Scotland, they've just wiped those people off the books. So therefore, there's not more jobs being created. You see the people that's unemployed around Dundee, like the lady's saying, and the people that's on the streets in Dundee, and the homeless and all. They're not employed. So where are you getting these jobs from that your figures are dreaming up? They're not real jobs.
Okay.
They're off the books.
Willie Rennie.
I think John has been far too modest. John predicted that this would happen because he produced, I don't know if you all remember, this secret cabinet paper, which was subsequently published in the newspapers. And it told us that Scotland's finances would be prone to volatility because of the oil price that may be volatile, that the pensions issue would be a major concern, that as a result there may be cuts to public services, there may be cuts to jobs. So John's been far too modest because he predicted all this before. But then he spent the next 2 years
It might be
trying to
what I
deny.
actually said, Willie, not what you've just made up. Well, it's just made that up, Willie, actually. You have made it up, Willie, I can assure you.
All right, hang on, let's sort this out.
You have made it up, I'm afraid.
He says you made it up.
But John predicted all those things.
Well, hang on, Willie. He says you made it up.
Well, he's wrong.
I've
read the paper. This is John's modesty taken over again. He was wrong
the argument
2 years ago, but then he spent the rest of the campaign dismissing everything that he was right about in the paper.
The argument I was putting forward was the need for us to take long-term protection, as Norway did, to create an oil fund, which is now worth £580 billion, and we've got nothing to show for it in Scotland.
This is wonderful. If everything is desperate, reach for the oil fund. The reality is...
It's worth £580 billion in Norway.
Come on, John. What you would need is growth rates 5 times higher than China in order to make up for this £15 billion deficit. That's the scale of the challenge. We all know about Chinese growth rates. They're not really real.
Okay.
But John's growth rates aren't real either. But he expects us to believe it all.
Patrick Harvey, and then I'll come to some members of the audience. I will come to you. Patrick Harvey.
Until that little set to, we were in real danger of having a thoughtful conversation about this issue. Cathy's question is very clearly asking whether the long-term case for independence is effectively dead as a result of these figures. I would say that the SNP's case for independence is challenged, but one of the reasons why the Greens never signed up to the big book of answers in the White Paper was that it was so heavily dependent on an oil-based future. Greens see this as a challenge not just for Scotland, but for all countries to break our over-reliance on fossil fuels before it's too late, not just for our climate, but before it's too late for our economy as well. This is a warning that comes not just from climate change activists. This came recently from the Governor of the Bank of England, demonstrating that our over-reliance on fossil fuel, an overvalued industry because we can't afford to burn everything we've found already, this is a source of potential immense financial instability for this country's economy, not just for areas like the North East, which have a lot of direct dependence on oil and gas, but on our whole economy as well. So the challenge for us has to be to find a break with that dead future and to invest in the alternatives. Okay. There are hundreds of thousands of jobs to be generated in the long-term, lasting, sustainable, well-paid jobs of the futures, industries that can last, not those that will be here today and gone tomorrow. That's the challenge for Scotland. I think we can meet that challenge in the context of independence one day, as many other small independent Northern European countries do, including those without oil. But whether we do that within the UK or outside of it as a strong, competent, independent country, this is an urgent break that we have to make in our economy because oil and gas is not our future.
The man over there, I'll come to Tim, the man there, and then I'll come to you up there, yes.
Yeah, I think it's ridiculous to say that, you know, because of this black hole that Scotland can't be independent, because the UK's like, what, £1.3 trillion in debt. I think it's just ridiculous. And, you know, for David Cameron and George Osborne to keep saying, oh, it's the last Labour government's fault. I mean, if I had £1 for every time they'd said that, I could probably pay for this black hole myself.
And the woman there, you. Yes, you. And then I'll come to you.
I believe that Scotland needs to be led without any more insecurity of referendums, money being wasted on referendums, because if we were to invest that money in making Scotland great, less people would want to leave Scotland rather than just Scotland leaving the UK or Europe.
All right, and you.
I despair listening to this panel. Every single one of you, what is the vision for the UK in terms of taking forward finances? We've got today 1,500 jobs in Glasgow City Council, jobs going in the NHS, jobs going in local authorities. Everybody's sitting arguing amongst themselves. What is your vision for the future to improve things? Don't sit and argue.
Okay. I haven't brought Tim Stanley in, so I'll bring him in. But
obviously, I hadn't spoken yet, so let me give, as an Englishman, let me give my vision for Scotland. It's, I bet you were waiting for that.
Very, very dangerous thing to do.
And it's quite obvious that the SNP gambled on the oil price remaining as high as it was then, so that they could finance independence. But I do hope that we're not all overtaken by a spirit of "I told you so." Partly because I think it's unhelpful, but also because, to me, this shortfall and the rising deficit actually makes the positive case for unionism. I'm a believer in the old-fashioned principle of Britain being one nation, which means we're undivided by region or by class or by language. And it means that if one part of the country is running a little bit short of cash, the other part of the country steps in and helps out. That, to me, is the principle of unionism, the idea that we're a family with collective responsibility for each other.
Okay. Sorry, yeah, well, you're shouting, but I don't normally bring in people who are shouting out from there because it gets so noisy, but have a go.
Right, I've just relocated from the Lake District. The reason I've done this...
To Dundee?
To Dundee.
Yes.
The reason I have done this as an Englishman of some Irish ancestry way back is because I can see things happening in Scotland that thrill me, that excite me, that makes me feel that this is a country going somewhere. And when you talk about, I know you're a member of sort of probably a Tory sympathiser, when you talk about the union helping people, living in the Lake District, I felt like a colony of the southeast of England. It seemed to be run for the city. It was not run for the benefit of England in its regions. It's run for the southeast.
Yes, but the southeast of England...
No, please, let me finish.
The southeast of England feels like a colony of the southeast of England. We hate that as much, but what you're making an argument for is for voting for socialism, not for voting for independence.
The point is that Scotland uniquely has the chance to go forward on a smaller, flexible, dynamic basis. And I was delighted to get the chance to move here. And it's becoming a bit like Canada is to the potential of being under Trump in the United States. People who can are moving.
Okay, Ruth, do you want to answer what he said?
Well, I'd like to answer this lady here, because I think there's been a lot of work done that has been trying to make sure that we have a positive economic vision for the whole country. That's things like reducing corporation tax to encourage investment, having the highest rate of growth in the last 3 years out of all the G7 nations. That means doing things in Scotland. I want to see more apprenticeships. I want to see us not cut 152,000 college places so we can train the next... We can have more investment in vocational training so we can train the next generation. These are the things that we're trying to do. These are the things I want to see happening in this country so that we can harness the growth that we're seeing across the whole country.
Yet more tax breaks for big businesses. How different from the UK's agenda for the last 30 years?
Right,
you can see consistent corporation tax cuts under Tory, under Labour, under the Coalition. This has been a flatline corporation tax cut.
If you don't understand, or if you don't recognise the link between reducing corporation tax and encouraging business growth, seeing the biggest economic growth of any G7 nation and more people in employment, then that's up for you. But here's something you will like. Here's something you will like. Something very simple that could be done, which has been done, which is put in a business champion in every embassy in the UK around the world so that we can try and get British businesses into other countries and help them around the world. These are things everyone can agree on. These are positive visions and actions that we can take to make sure that the next generation know that there's jobs on the horizon.
While we flog off our own local high streets to the multinationals and the big box retailers.
We've got only a quarter of an hour left. I'll just take one or two more points on this and then I'll move on. The man there, not you, but the man behind you in the white shirt. Yeah.
Aren't we, when we're talking about financials and the money, etc., one of the things I do find unusual is that you're talking about lies, damn lie statistics, and then, frankly, figures put out by political parties. Isn't it time that we had, like they've got in England, an OBR, Scottish OBR, so actually we can get some genuine figures and we can make an informed decision.
Well, we actually, but just before I came from Parliament in Edinburgh tonight, and at 6:15 tonight, Parliament legislated for the establishment of the Scottish Fiscal Commission, which will do exactly what you will do.
Okay.
It'll be independent of Parliament and of Government, and will give you the statistics that you're looking for.
There you have your answer. And I just come back to the questioner. You've heard all this. What do you make of it? Your question was whether the economic case for independence was now dead.
Well,
What's your view?
as we say in Scotland, the economic case for independence was hung on the shrigley peg, and now it's fallen to the floor, and I'm horrified that the SNP want to try and rehang that case on the very same peg. And those of us who predicted exactly the situation were constantly told we were talking Scotland down, that we were scaremongering, and I actually think that all of us are owed an apology.
Right. Well, I'm going to go on to another question. I've got to go to another question, but otherwise we'll just stick on the same topic, and I've got other questions here. But just to say, if you want to join us next week for Question Time, we're going to be in Chelmsford. Then there's a pause for Easter. We're in Ilford in East London after Easter. So you can apply to our website. You can call the number that's there. We'll give that all again at the end. Let me take this question from Laura Meach, please. Laura Meach.
With the majority of the NHS trusts in Scotland in financial difficulties, would the panel increase taxes to safeguard the future of the NHS in Scotland?
That's very clear. And of course it's true of the whole UK, really, that there are problems and financial difficulties everywhere. What would you do about it? Willie Rennie.
I think there is a desperate need for proper investment in the NHS. There is no doubt about that. We need to make sure we pass on all the budget consequentials of the protected NHS budget within England. We need to make sure that happens, to make sure we deal with the real crisis we've got in GP recruitment. Mental health services that are often neglected in this country need a proper boost, and we also need to invest in social care. But we have a commitment to increase taxes, because unlike John, who's been arguing for powers for 80 years and is now not going to use them, we're going to propose an increase in income tax for education, because John's government is butchering the education system. He's cutting 152,000 places from our colleges.
We're talking about NHS. I don't know whether you heard the question. It's about the NHS, not about education. You have to stick to the agenda the audience creates here. You can't just go off on a point that you want to talk about.
But the point also, David, was about increasing taxes. And I am in favour of increasing taxes to invest in public services, because I think that's absolutely the right thing to do. Well, I've already set out what we want to do with the NHS, but what we're proposing specifically, and this is why I deviated from your strict criteria, is because we are in favour of increasing investment in education, because John's government has butchered the education system.
Jenny Mara.
Laura, I think you're right to be concerned about NHS spending here in Scotland. We know that here in Dundee, NHS Tayside have got to make savings or cuts of £27 million over the next year, and that's brutal. And you'll probably know as well as I do that, you know, health services here in Dundee are really stretched. We've got a GP surgery in Lochee that's on the brink of survival because they can't attract. The Scottish Government is having real problems attracting GPs to work in our surgery. So there are some real problems in our NHS. One of the reasons we're in so much deficit in the NHS is of the SNP's reliance on agency nurses. There's more and more agency private nurses being called in to staff our NHS, and that's something that trend that really worries me. The Scottish Labour Party is committed going into this election, and I think along with the Liberals, we are the only party that's committed to saying, actually, we think people who can afford it should pay a little more, because the cuts that are coming from George Osborne and from John Swinney. You know, the council cuts in Dundee, 200 people, council workers are losing their jobs in this city because of these council cuts. So we're saying quite clearly that we would put a penny on income tax, and that people who can afford it should pay that little bit more to deliver the public services that you need.
For spending on the NHS or for spending on education?
Well, we've said that the health budget would be protected, completely protected, and to be fair, the Scottish Government have done that as well, although I think there are other problems in the health service. But we're saying that that money, to go back to the other question, should be invested in education and training, because our economy badly needs it.
So you'd be happy to see Scotland have a different income tax rate from the rest of the UK?
Yes, well,
you'd win votes on that?
Well, yes, we think we will. We think people are recognise the problems across this country in public services, and those who can afford it are prepared to pay that little bit more.
Tim Stanley.
I admire any politician who has the guts to say that they're prepared to raise taxes a little bit to finance something. I think that's very admirable. I would vote for it as a short-term measure. In the long run, we have to wake up to a structural problem facing the NHS, which is that we as a population are getting older. And a great deal of the NHS's problems in many ways are to do with failings in care for older people. And the NHS is going to have to change. It will happen within our lifetime. Politicians will resist it because they know that the principle behind the NHS is so popular. It is famously described as Britain's last remaining national religion. But something's got to change. It might be that governments encourage people to invest in old age insurance. It might be that some sort of top-up system is introduced so that some people pay a little bit extra for certain services. Either way, the idea that we can continue to supply such a monopoly, such a generous, well-funded monopoly that provides the kind of care that people expect on the model that we have right now of direct taxation, I fear that's not sustainable, and in the long run, some party has got to build up the nerve to take that on and change it.
John Swinney. Is it the SNP that will have the nerve to do what Tim's suggesting?
Well, let me say that what the SNP is doing, and we have responsibility for these things and we take it seriously. The health budget in Scotland is now £13 billion. It has never been as high as that at any point in history in the past. The level of employment in the National Health Service in Scotland is higher than when the SNP government came to office. So we've invested to create that larger staff pool. Now, the choice that I took in the budget, and it was my decision, was not to use the power available to me to increase taxation. And the reason was not, Jenny says it's because people who can afford to pay it would have to pay more. It's people on £11,000. Now, just hear me out.
John,
people on £11,000 would have to pay more in taxation, and I don't think that is fair to ask people at that rate of pay to pay more money into public expenditure.
That is not true, John. Because the tax thresholds have been raised as a result of the budget coming this year, it will mean that you'd have to earn over £19,000 to pay a single penny more in tax as a result of these measures. Now, I think that's fair and I think that's reasonable. If you're not a progressive, don't call yourself a progressive.
People on that level of salary, Willie, £11,000 would have to pay more in taxation, and I'm not prepared. And I'm not prepared to put. And I'm not prepared. And I'm not prepared to.
If they don't have a job as a result of your cuts, it doesn't matter because they won't be paying any tax anyway.
But there's plenty of people. But there are plenty of people at that level of salary who will have jobs and who would have to pay the tax that you want to pay.
Not if you carry on your route.
The key thing is
briefly, John, the
key thing is to shift. Is to put investment in to shift the balance of care. And we've put £250 million into integrating health and social care so that we bring these services together and shift the balance of care so that people spend less time in hospital, more time supported at home, getting the care that they require. That's the key reform that we've undertaken. We're further ahead than any other part of the United Kingdom, and our health service has been judged to be the leading health service in the United Kingdom, effectively delivering healthcare services.
Described by the Prime Minister David Cameron as a litany of failure.
And that's because.
Why do you say that?
And that's because the staff in our National Health Service work phenomenally hard to deliver the care that people in our country depend upon.
So what did you make of what David Cameron said at the Tory Party, Scottish Tory conference? Yeah. A litany of failure, the NHS.
I thought it was an insult to the health service staff that work in our hospitals. That's what I thought.
All right, Ruth Davidson.
The gentleman there just a moment ago said he didn't like lies, damn lies and statistics, and I'm only going to put in one statistic here, and it comes from the Independent Scottish Parliamentary Information Service. And they say that between 2010 and 2015, even though health spending in England went up by 7%, and there was a portion of that, all of that's passed on through Barnett consequentials, it only went up by 1% in Scotland. The SNP said they would pass on all of this money that's spent on the NHS down south and comes up here as proposed. They'd pass it all on to the NHS, and they didn't.
And we did.
And they didn't. The IFS says they didn't. The Independent Health Service...
Is all your politics tit for tat?
No, it's true, but it's just...
They've been skimming
nonsense.
They've been skimming money off the top and taking it away from healthcare for years. That's not my words. That's the Independent Parliamentary Information Service. What I want
the
to
rise
see
in Scotland
is
and England was 1% between 2011 and 2013, exactly the same, 1% each, according to the Treasury figures.
in terms of the Dell budget that was passed on, it was 7% rise in England, 1% rise in Scotland. We want every single penny passed on, and we don't think that low-paid workers should have to pay for the SNP skimming money off the top for populist measures like white papers and referendums. It should all go on health.
Patrick
There will be a very dangerous consequence if we think that this problem, and there are serious long-term challenges within the NHS and the rest of our public services, if we think that that can be solved simply by passing on Barnett consequentials, simply by having the same spending pattern between departments as the UK government. Because at the same time as we're attempting to do this integration of social care and health, which is the right thing to do, but it's challenging, particularly when people are under pressure and under-resourced. At the same time, the local councils, which deliver those social care services, are having their budgets cut massively. I think that we cannot protect our public services, which all of us depend on, unless we are willing to raise the revenue that's necessary to pay for them.
Why did you vote against it in the budget? You had a chance to vote for an increase in taxation and you declined.
All right, you sit in the third row. I want to hear from some members of our audience.
Let me
We
answer
only
that
a couple of minutes left.
Very serious
Let's not do
allegation.
counter-claim and claim and counter-claim.
It's all very well banding about statistics and
Yes.
plans. We want long-term reassurances that we're not going to be threatened with a privatised health service
Absolutely.
in danger of TTIP
Absolutely.
and things like that in the future.
Okay.
So can we stop arguing?
You said that you wanted to speak in the blue, yes. Just here. Yes.
Five minutes ago, I heard a really interesting provocation from Tim Stanley about taking a strategic view of the NHS. And I then listened to our same old politicians bickering about who's spending more money, who's putting more nurses out, and the inevitable obligatory pat on the head to aren't the nurses wonderful, which any of them will say. How about responding to Tim's provocation and give us your strategic view of what the NHS might look like?
Laura Meach, I want to come back to you, who asked the question.
It's all very well saying that your budgets are being protected. However, NHS Tayside, as you said, Jenny, is £27 million in deficit this year.
Do you want to see taxes go up?
I don't particularly want to see taxes go up, but something has to be done.
Absolutely.
All right, Patrick Harvey, you was...
Listen, I was a wee bit disappointed with where they there, because the Liberal Democrats, the Greens and the Labour Party in the most recent Scottish budget all proposed ways of raising taxes more fairly from those who can afford to pay. We proposed different ways of doing it, and it's perfectly legitimate to have that debate about different ways of doing it. We think it can be done most appropriately at a local level, because we're talking about local services 9 times out of 10 that are under the most pressure. But look, if we want a provocation about wouldn't it be great if those who can afford to pay more get to buy extra services on top of the NHS, I would reject that absolutely. I don't think we can afford to surrender the principle that we are all of us collectively better off if we pay for our healthcare on that collective basis. And frankly, I can afford to pay a bit more tax, an MSP or an MP can afford to pay a bit more tax. The people who are sitting on property wealth that's even more unfairly distributed than income in Scotland can afford to pay a bit more tax.
Thank you. Thank you. And one last point. The woman there in the striped shirt, yes.
Is it not also really important to point out that the World Health Organisation's actually came out and said that the UK no longer has an NHS, that by their definition it's been abolished?
I think south of the border they may well be right.
OK. I think we have to stop, I'm afraid, because our hour is up. Doesn't feel like it, does it? And with you lot, we go on a long time. No, thank you all very much indeed. It is our hour is up. We're going to be in Chelmsford next week. We've got the Education Secretary, Nicky Morgan, for the Tories, and the Shadow Defence Secretary, Emily Thornberry, for Labour. Then there's a pause, and then on April the 7th, we're going to be in Ilford in East London. So if you can come to the audience in Chelmsford or in Ilford, go to our website or call the number 0330 123 988 that's on the screen. If you're listening to 5 Live, as you know, this debate will go on into the night in Question Time, Extra Time. But here in Dundee, my thanks to all 6 panellists who came here to take part, and to all of you in our audience who played such a provocative role in countering the many assertions you heard made. I'm very grateful to you. Thank you very much. From Dundee until next Thursday from Question Time, good night.
Well, don't head to bed just yet. Plenty more political debate to come next here on BBC One. Andrew Neil's waiting with This Week.